these things where you can see them on the screen.
Okay, great. I think the number of participants is leveled off here pretty well, so I think we're going to get started. Thanks everyone for joining this Friday afternoon. I want to repeat myself, so I think we're going to hold questions till the end, but you can enter your questions in the question and answer box. There should be a little button down at the bottom. And I think the way we'll run this is I'll moderate through the questions. So at the very end, we'll pick some of the questions and try to work our way through them depending on how much time we have left. So feel free to enter them as we're going so you don't forget your question if that happens to you like it does to me. And we'll get to them at the end. All right, so Al Ragsdale flew the Lunar Mission Simulator daily pre-flights and mission test for Singer Link at Johnson Space Center from October 1967 to the end of the Apollo program in 1972. It was also at Mission Control for the Apollo 11 lunar landing. And this presentation is a summary of the Lunar Module GN&C based on 5 years of personal experience in the LMS cockpit. So thanks, Al, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rick. I'm Al Ragsdale. I was very lucky when I was 24 years old. I started working for Singer Link in Houston about the same time the Lunar Module Simulator, we just called it the LMS. Its official name was the Lunar Module Mission Simulator, but we just called it the LMS. And my job officially was I was a system engineer for equations of motion and weight and balance, what I guess we call mass properties nowadays. And the first thing I did was generate initial conditions. And we did a lot of that by hand. We didn't have we didn't have calculators. I used slide rules and an abacus and an adding machine, a Frieden that I had a 4-function Frieden calculator, they called it then. You had to do a square root with a Newton-Raphson. So part of my job was to generate the initial conditions for the simulator and then test them. I would come in every morning at 4 o'clock usually and test anything that had changed since the last time we ran, and I would do whatever the crew was going to train on that day to make sure that it would work. And so I was only 24 years old. I'd been there about 1.5 years when Apollo 11 happened, and by that time I was 25. But so I would come in at 4 o'clock in the morning, and if anything had changed, it was my job to verify that it was going to do whatever they wanted to do that day. People ask me, did I know the astronauts or meet them? Of course, they came into the simulator, but I was very shy at first, and I didn't say a lot to them. And if they called me down, it was because there was a problem. So, but Buzz Aldrin in particular used to come in at around 5 o'clock in the morning and stand behind me, which was very intimidating to have an astronaut stand behind you while you're doing your work. He wouldn't say much. He was just, I guess his life depended on what we were doing. So he wanted to know that we knew what we were doing. This picture is Buzz Aldrin walking down the ladder because Neil Armstrong had the camera, and nearly all the pictures of an astronaut on Apollo 11 are Buzz Aldrin, since Neil had the camera. There's one picture of, you can see Neil reflected in Buzz's helmet. And that's the best picture there is of Neil Armstrong on the moon. An overview of what I'm going to talk about, not just GN&C, but all about the vehicle and how it worked. We'll talk first about the LEM descent trajectory, and then the LEM vehicle itself. It had 2 stages, a descent and ascent stage. The reaction control system was little jets around the corners of the vehicle that fired to rotate the vehicle, and also to make small, fine adjustments to translation. The cockpit and instrument panels, I will go have a slide or two about the primary guidance navigation system and control system. It was PGNCS, but nobody could pronounce that, so they called it PINGS. Then the abort guidance system was a simpler computer in case the pings failed. Originally, they called it the backup guidance system, but then the word bugs became meant a bad computer, a malfunctioning computer, so they changed it from bugs to eggs. The Apollo landing video I won't do today, but I'll tell you how to find it. It will have a recording of the actual landing with a lot of notes and comments around the screen. And basically, I was also lucky enough to be in mission control. They asked me to be there for that landing since I'd flown the simulator as much as anybody else had at that time. And this is an excellent video that's put out by the Apollo Journal. And it's you can hear what I was hearing, but we didn't have the picture then. But anyway, there's a nice video, and then I'll talk about some personal memories and some references. Okay, I like this picture because it gives you an idea of what the features are on the moon. I don't remember where I got this picture, but I think that's an Atlas rocket launching, and somebody just happened to catch it flying in front of a full moon. And the question people want to know is where did Neil Armstrong land? And there's an easy way to tell. If you look at the north pole of the moon in this picture is on the left, and the equator runs from the top to the bottom. And they were flying along the equator about like that. That's the Sea of Crises there. And then that's the Sea of Fertility. And this is the Sea of Tranquility. And this is the Sea of Nectar. They came around the moon. We tracked them for a little bit at mission control to make sure everything was okay. And then they lit the engine right about here, landed right about here. And easy way to spot that, if you're looking at the moon, is the way little kids draw a rabbit, two circles. This is the body, this is the head, the two ears. So this is the Sea of Tranquility, and he landed about where the Sea of Nectar touches the rabbit's head. And on a full moon or even a half moon, that's pretty easy to see on the eastern side of the moon. Although the moon's not always exactly in this attitude, but you can spot that rabbit easily. What you're seeing when you look at the moon, the white areas are mountains, and the dark areas are big flat plains. They call them seas, or oceans, or whatever, because the people a long time ago thought that they actually were. There was even one theory that the moon was a mirror that was reflecting the Earth. But and the low spots on the moon filled up with lava when the moon was young. And so all the low, just like on Earth, the low spots filled up with water and made the oceans. On the moon, this was basalt lava that was darker than the mountains, and that's why there are those dark spots on the moon. I remember that he landed by the ear there. That's what the Sea of Tranquility looks like. They took this picture an orbit or two before they landed, and that yellow line is their planned path for landing over the Sea of Tranquility. That Sea of Tranquility is about 200, 250 miles wide, what we're seeing from here to here. Now, there were several landmarks on Apollo 11. They actually flew looking down at the surface so they could spot these landmarks and make sure they were where they were supposed to be. This little feature here they call Boot Hill because it looks kind of like a boot. And this is Mescaline W, a crater they flew almost over. And then here's a rill, like a canyon going across the moon. And there was 3 craters right here, right close together that look like a clover leaf. And when you see the film, you can make out these distinct features. It goes over Boot Hill, then you see Mescaline W go by, and then you see the rill there and the clover leaf. This big crater over here is Mescaline, and they flew. This was the approach path, and notice that they landed over where the sun was right. If it was on Earth, it'd be about 6 o'clock in the morning. The sun was rising behind them, so the surface wouldn't be too hot, and it also would make you could see shadows very clearly from there and make out boulders and things that might be in your way. This crater over here is the nearest crater to where they landed, and it's called Moltke. That was the planned path. Okay, this is the descent trajectory. The LEM was being flown by a computer for all but the last 2 minutes of the path of the descent. And the beginning over here, they call it PDI, Powered Descent Initiation. That happened at about 50,000 feet. And they were running a program called P63, or the braking phase. And they started off about 250 miles from the planned landing site at a horizontal velocity of 55, 60 feet per second and H dot roughly 0. Incidentally, all these things use conventional units, although because that's what Apollo did. So that's why I show these using English or customary units. At around 40,000 feet, now the LEM was flying. Let me get my toy here. Okay, the LEM was flying like this. Okay, so their windows are pointed down towards the moon, and the engine's thrusting to slow it down. During P63, the thrust was kept approximately opposite the velocity vectors. If you did that perfectly, that's what they call a gravity turn. But it was close to a gravity turn. The thrust vector was pointed along the velocity vector. But if you kept doing that, as you got close to your landing site, you'd be backing into the landing site. So you didn't want to do that. So at 40,000 feet, Neil Armstrong yawed the LEM around so he's looking up, but now he can't see where he's going. So, and then it gradually pitched over until later on at P64, he had actually pitched over far enough that he could see where he was planning to land. The LEM's engine was either running at 100% or it could be throttled between 10 and 60. If you got over 60, it became unstable. So you'd either had to run it 100% or somewhere between 10 and 60. And when the guidance calculated that it didn't need more than 60% thrust to hit the target, it would throttle back to 60%. And then from then on, it stayed between 60 and 10. The P64 part started around 8,000 feet in altitude, around 28,000 feet in range. It was going forward about 450 feet per second and sinking about 150 feet per second at the beginning of P64. Each one of these phases had a target that it had an altitude rate, velocity, and range that it was supposed to be from the target at a certain. It would calculate the time to go to reach that target, and then it had a fourth order quadratic equation that said from that equation, and assuming a certain amount of jerk or the rate of deceleration, it would, based on the time to go, it would say, well, okay, I'm too high, so I need to pitch a little bit to change that, or throttle down if I'm not going fast enough. But it had a target. Each one of these P63, 64, 65 had a target that it was aiming for, and it was always based on the time it was estimating it was going to take to get to that target. P64 was flying roughly an approach angle of about 16 degrees. They picked that angle because it corresponds to an L over D of about 3.5 for an airplane gliding, and Neil Armstrong had flown the X-15. So they thought that would look, like a steep approach, but one that he could handle. Somewhere around 200 feet or so, when it was always counting down for the time to go to reach the next target. And when it was going to be about 30 seconds from the end of P64, when it was almost to its target, it would go to P65, which what P65 did was just zero all your horizontal velocity and maintain a 3 foot per second sink rate. If you didn't touch it, it would come down with 0 forward and lateral velocity and come straight down at 3 feet per second until it hit something. But none of the pilots ever used P65. They always took over manually, and that was P66, was a semi-automatic mode where the pilot was flying the attitude, the pitch and the roll, and yaw if you needed it, of the vehicle to steer, much like a helicopter, toward a target. And you were supposed to touch down at less than 5 feet per second, forward, lateral, or vertical. During that time, the computer would fly, if you didn't do anything, it would fly 3 feet per second. But once you got to P66, there was a semi-automatic mode. It's kind of like a cruise controller in a car, that if you wanted to decrease the sink rate, there was a little switch you could flip up. For every click up, it changed it by 1 foot per second, every click down. So you're supposed to be 15 feet per second at 500, 6 at 200, 3 at 100, and then hold 3 until you landed. That was what was planned. That was not what happened. Another little interesting thing about this was the H dot below 1,000 feet was always supposed to be about 3% of your altitude. And some of the crews joked about you always had 30 seconds to live, because if you keep maintaining that 3% of the altitude, you're going to hit the ground in 30 seconds. So it gives you plenty of time to decide if you're going to abort or change your sink rate or whatever you needed to do. But you were trying to, you always just maintain 3% of the altitude, and you can see 15 at 5, 6 at 200. But it didn't actually come out that way. Okay, the descent trajectory started in an orbit 60 nautical miles high, and the LEM did a burn to bring it down so that pericyntheon, or low point in the orbit, was about 50,000 feet. Okay, in the P63 phase, the thrust vector was approximately opposite the velocity. At 40,000 feet, they yawed 180 degrees, so you could see forward, but for the final landing approach. The landing radar, once the vehicle yawed around, then the landing radar could track the surface below them, and it couldn't tell where they were, but it could tell how fast they were moving and how high they were from the landing radar. 64 approach phase had another option that the pilot could punch proceed on the disky, the display and keyboard for the computer, and then move the stick, and that would move his target. If he moved it forward, it would move his target forward, back, left, right. It was a certain number of degrees of the gamma angle that it would change for each time you move the joystick. Armstrong didn't use that, but all the later pilots did. There was a reason he didn't use it, because that fourth order quadratic guidance equation could fly under the surface of the moon and come up to the target from below. And they decided it wasn't safe to do that yet until they got that bug fixed. They call that the redesignation bug. So Apollo 12 and on used it, but Armstrong didn't. The automatic landing was never used. I think I've described what you had to do there. You changed the rate of descent by clicking a little. There were two handles that you could hold when you're flying the LEM. They look kind of like a hot dog, about the size and shape of a hot dog, on both sides of the panel. And when they were flying, they were being held to the floor with bungee cords, and they gripped those two handles. You didn't, since the computer was flying it, you didn't need to have your hands on the controls or anything. So, but you could reach that ROD switch while you're still gripping that handle. Okay, and there was also a P67 with manual throttle, but they decided very quickly that the pilot workload was too heavy to do that, and they never used it. So P65 and 67 were never used, and eventually they took it out of the computer. Well, this was the Chariot. This is the ascent stage where the crew and the computers, and this was the stage that got them back into orbit, and I'll talk more about that later. And this was the descent stage, with big engine in the middle of it and the ladder down the front. Notice there are these little sensing probes that were about 5 feet long under the landing pods, so that when it touched the surface, they would know they were 5 feet high. And notice there's not one on the front leg, and they didn't put one there because they were afraid it might get kinked somehow and mess up so you couldn't get down the ladder with it. So they took it off that one. It had a rendezvous radar to track the command module for the rendezvous, VHF antenna to talk to the command module, and the S-band antenna to talk to Earth. And they hear these little thrusters on the 4 corners of the vehicle. It had a descent stage for landing and ascent stage for the launch and the rendezvous. The propellants, I've learned since I made this slide that it was actually a 50% mixture of UDMH, unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine, and 50% pure hydrazine. And nitrogen tetroxide was the oxidizer. This combination is storable and hypergolic, which means if you mix them together, they will ignite. So if you could get fuel, the oxidizer and fuel together in the engine, it would ignite. The ISP was about 305. That would produce 305 pounds of thrust for every pound per second that it was burning. The total weight of the LEM was, the Apollo 11 was 33,680 pounds, was 23 feet high, 14 feet wide, but the leg span was 31 feet. There's an exact LEM in the Smithsonian in Washington. You can see exactly what it looked like. Oh, this shows the 2 stages and what were inside them. The descent stage was mostly fuel tanks and a helium tank that pressurized the tanks for the descent engine that was underneath the middle of it. The descent engine could gimbal. It could always fire through the center of gravity. The ascent stage had the antennas on top to point to the command module, to talk to Earth, to talk to the command module, and it had its own, the same propellants with a smaller engine, but its engine didn't gimbal at all, and it wasn't throttleable. It was just always either on or off. It made for an interesting ride during the liftoff. It would rise till it was going upward at 50 feet per second and then pitch down 45 degrees, which it gave you the impression from flying an airplane that you were about to dive back into the ground. And all the RCS jet thrusters, it had to stay within a dead band of some attitude. And so what would happen, a jet would fire to move. If you got outside the dead band, the jet would fire. And then once you got back inside the dead band, it would fire again. But this is happening on the roll, pitch, and yaw axis simultaneously. So it actually, a lot of people, it was a fixed base simulator, and you could see all that rocking around and jets firing all over the place. It made a lot of people seasick or airsick to fly this. Not any astronauts, but some of the visitors would get sick because that thing rocked around so much during the launch. The descent stage weighed 22,910 pounds. Its dry weight was about 4,700 pounds, and it carried 18,000 pounds of propellant. The engine had a nominal maximum thrust of 10,000 pounds. As I've said, it was throttleable between 10 and 60%. It was gimbaled in the pitch and roll axis, which it tried to stay pointed through the center of gravity. If it didn't, the RCS jets would fire to keep it there. The lunar thrust to weight is important. With the tanks full, it was 1.7, and with the tanks dry, it was 3.7, and at landing weight, it was about 27% thrust. The ascent stage, excuse me, I'm drying up here, excuse me. The ascent stage contained the crew, the computers, the guidance, navigation, control equipment. It had about as much room in it as a couple of telephone booths, if you could imagine that. And the crew stood up, they didn't sit down. The total weight was 10,700 pounds. Dry weight was 4,900 pounds. It had 5,200 pounds of ascent propulsion system propellants and 634 pounds for the RCS jets. The engine, the ascent engine, had 3,500 pounds of thrust, it was not throttleable or gimbaled, and the lunar thrust to weight with when all the tanks were full was 1.8, which was enough to make sure you lifted off. And when the tanks were dry, it was 3.6. The reaction control system, these little, if you can see it on this thing, these little quads on the corner of on the four corners of the vehicle, there and there and there and there. They were mutually perpendicular, 4 jets in each quadrant pointing up, down, forward, and to the side. And they provided 6 degrees of freedom, rotation, and translation. Each jet had 100 pounds of thrust. So you could fire 2 jets, would accelerate you at about 1.1 feet per second. The rotational jets could be fired 1 up, 1 down to produce a balanced couple. And they, depending on the mass of the vehicle and which axis you're talking about, the 2 jets would accelerate you at 8 to 28 degrees per second. So some of the crews commented that this vehicle was very sporty. When firing a jet for 1 second, change your rate by 28 degrees per second. So to avoid that problem, there was another mode that it would fire the jet for a minimum duration of 14 milliseconds. And that would change your rotation rate about 0.12 to 0.4 degrees per second. They used that mode when they were doing where the attitude really mattered, like during docking. During the landing, the jets were just used to maintain the vehicle oriented in the correct direction. The jets were usually fired in pairs. There was a 4-jet option. For example, if you wanted to thrust, just the ascent stage here, you could fire all 4 jets. They call that plus X in the limb, but you could fire all 4 jets if you wanted to, which would accelerate a little faster if you wanted to do that. There were 2 systems that were redundant. They call them A and B. Each one had the propulsion system for 8 jets. And once you were in orbit, you could cross feed. If the APS, the ascent engine had propellants left over, you could cross feed that into the RCS tanks. This is the front office. I spent many an hour in this. This is what it looked like on the inside, and the simulator was as near a duplicate as they could do. The commander, Armstrong, stood on this side, and the limb pilot stood on this side. It's interesting, the limb pilot was the person who didn't fly it. There's a story behind that. But so informally, this man was the commander. The Russians thought CDR was an abbreviation for Tsar. And Buzz Aldrin would occasionally refer to Neil Armstrong as the Tsar. And informally, we referred to the LMP as the limp, and the command module pilot as the CMP, was the chimp. Anyway, the instrument panels here, I'll go in more detail on them in a little bit, but some things you really want to know here. This was a joystick for Armstrong. It looked pretty much like a computer game joystick. That was a new idea then, to fly a vehicle with a joystick. But it was a 3-axis joystick that it could pitch or roll or yaw, and the pitch was the pivoting from the middle of your wrist. I'm doing this, you can't see it off screen. Okay, and over here's the throttle on the other side. It had a little grip, looked like a football, and you could move a lever and then move it up and down like an airplane throttle. Or if you move the lever the other direction, then you could push forward, aft, left, right, up, down, and it would fire jets to make it translate in the direction you push that handle. Let's see, there's that grip handle I was talking about. Another one here that they were holding on to those during most of the time they were landing. Notice that here's some cables for bungee cords that held them down to the floor. This was the main computer display keyboard screen that was doing most of the work. And notice, and over here on the other side was the abort guidance system, the backup computer. Interesting feature you can see in this that made history. Notice the hinges on this door here are on the right, so it would swing, this side swing into the cabin. And when they tried that in the simulator to get outside to pretend they had landed on the moon and try to go outside, they had been practicing in just ordinary street clothes. But the first time they came into flight with their spacesuits, Buzz Aldrin was standing over here on the right, and when they opened that hatch, he couldn't get around it. He couldn't get over it. It's about this big as 2 telephone booths, and this door is about as big as the space under a typical desk. So he got behind it, and he couldn't get around it or over it with a spacesuit on. So that's why Neil Armstrong was the first one to go outside. With that door open, all he had to do was kneel down and crawl out the door. And that's one of the reasons that Neil Armstrong became the first man on the moon. Notice the scale in the window here. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That was how they knew where they were going to land. They would read numbers off this disky, and it would tell them what angle to sight through that window, and they knew that was where it was planning to come down. That's called the LPD, or landing point designator. Yeah, and the hatch opens so it was easier for the commander to exit first. They're large forward triangular windows for landing. The field, standing in the normal position, you could see down more than 50 degrees. And the scale on the window was used to determine the landing target. There was an overhead window right here for docking, which was literally a pain in the neck in Earth gravity to try to look out that top of the window for an hour or two. And they abandoned that and decided it was better just to have the limb move into position about 30 feet in front of the command module, and the command module actually did the docking. There was a sight that they could use, put it here or in that window to measure. You're looking through a sight, so you know when you were lined up with a command module for docking. And this was a telescope that was used to align the inertial measurement unit to make sure you were lined up where you're supposed to be with respect to the stars. I just put this slide in here to scare you. This was all the things that the crew had to know how to do. Most things were turned on and off with these circuit breakers, and there were all these panels for control modes and turn valves on and off and turn batteries on and off. And there was a lot to learn. And there's the joystick, and there's the throttle, and that little push button thing that made the radar descent up or down was right there. So it doesn't show the handle grip here, but he could reach it with his hand on that grip. The pilot controls, they called it the ACA, but we call it a joystick nowadays. It had 3-axis rotation, pitch, roll, and yaw. There were 3 modes you could select. Rate command made it fly similar to an airplane. If you move the stick, it rotated. If you let go of it, it would stop and hold that attitude. And the further you push the stick, the faster you rotated. And that was the way they flew most of the landings. The pulse mode would just fire the jet for a minimum amount of time so that it would slowly accelerate or rotate. And direct mode was only for emergency, that if all else failed, if you went to direct mode, if you move the stick, the jet's fired till you let go of it. And also that joystick was used to redesignate the target in P-64. The thrust translation at TTCA was the throttle, and it had the 3-axis translation acceleration, as I said. And the vertical axis could be switched to use as a throttle for the descent engine, but they abandoned that soon after they started. There was an engine on-off button. There was nothing to shut they didn't want anything automatic to shut the engine off. They wanted to do it. So it was right here. You push that button to shut the engine off. And the rate of descent switch was a paddle switch and changed the vertical velocity by 1 foot per second. This is a close-up. I have a document at AMA that has a better, bigger picture of this, but basically this is the 8-ball artificial horizon, but it had all 3 axes. It had yaw, pitch, and roll, like a little globe, basically. It was set up so that when you should land with that at 0, 0, 0, they would align it up so that it would show 0 pitch, 0 yaw, 0 roll at touchdown. These little needles off to the side here were telling you what the computer wanted you to do, and if you were in automatic mode, it was very comforting to see that those needles stayed centered, because that meant it was doing what the computer wanted it to. This instrument to the right, that's an altimeter, and this is the rate of descent or climb meter, just like an airplane basically, except it was a tape. And this was a G meter measured in lunar Gs. So if you did 1 G, then you were balancing your weight with thrust. This instrument up here was a cross pointer that got, during the landing, that would move up and down and left and right to show you what your forward and lateral velocity were. And so if that was centered like it's shown in this picture, you were coming straight down, and that's the way you wanted to be for the landing. This little blue light right here was a lunar contact light that you knew one of those probes had touched the ground when that came on. And they made it blue so it wouldn't scare you. If it had been yellow or red or something, they decided blue was the color for that light. A red light would frighten people, I guess. These are 2 important buttons. The abort switch here, if you pushed it, the descent stage would go to full thrust and bring the vehicle to a vertical attitude, so it would just start climbing away till it ran out of gas. But to make sure you didn't crash. And the one on the right, abort stage, would drop the descent stage and fire the abort engine. It would switch to the ascent guidance to put you back into orbit. So typically, in the sense when we had to abort, you would abort by pushing that and drop and fire the descent till it ran out of gas to make sure you had plenty, and then push the abort stage button, and it would stage and then fly its way into orbit. There was a host of other switches, things here, but those were the important ones. The commander's instrument panel had a flight director. The attitude and body rotation rates were all on that FDAI. It had your roll, pitch, and yaw, and your body rotation rates, and what the flight director was tell you what the computers were saying you should be doing. And the tapes, I described altitude and range. The cross pointers, and during the rendezvous, it showed the elevation and azimuth rates while it was tracking the command module, so that if you kept those centered, you would eventually, if you kept it centered, you would have run into the command module eventually. The lunar contact light, and you had to shut the engine down manually. There were thrust command versus thrust you were actually getting, fuel oxidizer, helium gauges, engine temperature, pressure gauges. This was all on the LMP side of the cockpit. And there were mission and event timers and the switches, the abort switches. And there was a jillion display and control mode switches. The pings, the functions it performed was orbital navigation based on the IMU. It had an IMU, inertial measurement stable platform, that stayed aligned to a known alignment with the stars they call REFSMAT, the reference to stable member matrix. And it had accelerometers and rotational gyros on it that was how it determined. And then you take those accelerations, integrate them to get your velocity, integrate the velocity to get your position, assuming you knew where you were when you started. It provided guidance for deorbit, landing, the ascent, and the rendezvous. The controls were what they called a digital autopilot that determined all those modes I was saying about the rate, command, attitude, hold. It was programmed in machine language. It was hardwired into a core read-only memory. It was tiny by modern standards. It was about the size and the capability of a Commodore 364, if you remember those. Commodore 64, I meant to say. It had 36 16 bit words are equivalent to 72 kilobytes, which is tiny. But Commodore 64 was 64 kilobytes. But anyway, it had 2K of erasable memory, or where you could store values. The read-only memory stored the programs. The erasable memory stored the values. And it took it 85. It could do 85,000 operations per second, which is extremely slow by modern standards. It weighed about 70 pounds, was about the size of an average briefcase, and it used 55 watts of power. There's the Disky. Yeah, this was where we spent most of our time learning how to use this thing. What it had was what looked like a numeric keypad here, plus, minus buttons, and a verb and a noun, and then clear, proceed, release the key, enter, or reset. And the display, it boggles my mind that we were able to do everything we could with this simple computer. But it had programs. There were 39 programs from 00 to, I forget the highest number, but it was less than 99. And a verb meant do something, and the noun said do it to what. So you could say like verb 16, noun 60 would show your altitude rate, and forward velocity. And so you would hit verb 16, noun 60, enter, and it would change the display here. You could change the program by another combination of buttons. In fact, all the things you had to know to use this, we had this little handbook here that I had this in my hands when they were landing on the moon, so I could figure out what all that was going on. And somebody later put together a sheet that's all the verbs and nouns. See, that's all the verbs and nouns that you could do with a thing and what they all meant. It was a fascinating little. Over here is the computer activity light would blink if the computer was doing something, and if it wasn't doing anything, the program would say program 00. So they call that poo. And sometimes in some of the transcripts, that crew would say that computer went to poo, and that's what it meant. It was just idling. It wasn't doing anything. But the one that scared everybody was this program alarm here came on during the landing, which meant the computer's telling you you got a problem, and it would replace these numbers with a 5-digit code. Notice there's no decimal point. You had to know where the decimal point was in the numbers to use this. Anyway, that was the Disky. Some verbs you do verb 57 enter meant use the landing radar data for navigation. Here's verb 16, noun 60. It was horizontal velocity, how fast you're going forward, altitude rate, and your computed altitude. But you had to know where the decimal point was from that display. And there were alarm lights if things went on. And the most annoying one was the one that said operator error, which happened a lot. The backup abort guidance system, this was a lot simpler. It was smaller and simpler. All you had there was you would clear, enter a 3-digit address, and it would tell you what value was in that address. And so you had to know where the decimal point was and what it meant. But it only had the capability of getting you back into orbit and flying. And over here's the engine cutoff switch for the command for the limb pilot. It was on the side of that. The abort guidance system could only do orbit, and so you couldn't land with it. It had a strapped-down inertial navigation system, which means that body-mounted accelerometers and rate gyros, and it just calculated its attitude by integrating how fast it was rotating and integrating accelerometers. But you had to initialize it either from the pings from the ground typing in numbers or from the ground. It had to be initialized to know where to start integrating from. It had 2K of ROM and 2K of RAM, 18-bit words. So that's about 4K of modern. Everything it did, it had to do. It was somewhat faster than the pings. It could do 200 operations in a second. Okay, the Apollo 15 video, it's, make sure I get it right here. It's the Apollo flight, you can Google Apollo Flight Journal, Apollo 11, the complete descent. And it's an excellent presentation that goes over a lot of the same things I've said here. The original film was filmed with a camera that Buzz Aldrin had mounted in the window at about a 45-degree angle looking down. So the image was tilted, but Apollo Flight Journal people tilted it back straight. And it's around the side of the screen, it's got what everybody was saying. And that's what we were hearing at Mission Control. We couldn't see the picture. All we could see was the numbers and try and figure out what was happening. Some of the highlights that, since history hasn't changed, that you see the same things. Boot Hill is very obvious when you go by it, and Masculine W, and then Diamondback Rill. When he came to the Cloverleaf, that's where he did the yaw around at 40K, and you'll notice that it's yawing very slowly, and then it stops and then starts moving faster. He had a switch in the wrong position. So he saw that it wasn't rotating fast enough, and he changed the rate command switch, and it rotated a lot faster. You can't see the horizon for a while, and then as you approach West Crater, Aldrin couldn't see it. It was on the left side. Armstrong could see the crater, and with that LPD, he could see that he was aimed for very near or in the middle of that crater. So he had to take over manually about 550 feet and fly across West Crater. And then when he got down to about 70 feet, there was a crater they called East Crater or Little West Crater, about 80 feet in diameter, that he didn't want to land there either. So you notice there's a lot of dust kicking up, and you can see the leg shadow, and he was still moving forward at touchdown in the film. Okay, these are some of the references that I used to generate this report. Okay, it died. Well, that concludes my talk.
Okay, great. Thanks, Al. That was a lot of interesting information from the insider's perspective. We have a few questions I'll go through, and if anyone else has any questions, feel free to use the question and answer button. There's a little Q&A button, I think, down at the bottom. Let's see. I guess one question is about how many hours did you spend flying the simulator?
Well, I flew it every morning for, I guess it was from 67 before it was, the LMS was operational yet. I would fly it an hour or two. I had to check out whatever. And also, I flew the mission test. There were certain things like for the landing and the rendezvous and all that. Somebody had to fly it to verify that it was doing what MIT said it would do. And that was I was Link's limb pilot. So I had to test it. And if something went wrong in the middle of a training session, they would call me down there. But I don't know. We flew 24/7. We were there. It was, I often worked 60-hour weeks, and I've never added up the hours. But if you do it, if you do that for 3 or 4 years, an hour or two a day, that's a lot of hours.
Yeah, definitely. All right. There was a question about what different manual landing modes were available to the astronauts, and which ones did they actually use during the landings? Okay,
the P-66 with the auto throttle was what they always used. All of them actually landed with that. Where the computer is, you command a sync rate with that little switch, the ROD switch, and you would command a sync rate, and it would decide the throttle it took to get you there. And they always flew the rate command attitude hold, because that was very similar to flying a helicopter. One thing that was very noticeably different, though, was in the 1/6 gravity, you had to pitch 6 times as far to get the same acceleration. So to the pilots, it seemed like they were having to make great big pitch and roll motions close to the ground. Because lunar gravity is 1/6 of the Earth, you have to pitch 6 times as far to get the same acceleration. But they all landed in the rate command attitude hold attitude mode in the auto throttle rate of descent mode. T66.
There's a question here about why do you say that the LEM yaws 180 instead of rolling to face upwards?
Okay, that was one of the things I pointed out in that report I wrote about lessons learned. The LEM considered the x-axis out the top. So to the pilot, that was a yaw. You know.
Yeah. Okay.
And the z-axis was forward and the y was out to the right. So you know, x cross z is y. But they called it a yaw because to the pilot, you're spinning it around like yawing an airplane.
Okay. Let's see, it says, were the IMUs the only source of the velocity vector components?
Well, you have the AGS doing its thing over there with the strap down system, but yes, well, they would uplink a state vector if it got too far off. They were tracking it with radar from the ground, and they knew where the computer thought it was, and if it got too far off, they would uplink a state vector from the ground. It said at this time you're at these coordinates with this speed, and then it would continue to integrate from those. And then of course the landing radar and the rendezvous radar both were added to the IMU's values. For example, when they first came around the moon, they had an altitude. They were 2,900 feet lower than the computer thought they were, and it took the landing radar to fix that.
Okay, we have a couple questions about the simulation visual imagery. What was used? How was that generated for the through the windows in the simulator?
It was a big fiberglass model. I think it was 30 feet in diameter with a typical lunar scenery on it, and there was a camera that moved over it. You know, the camera was showing what you were seeing out the window, being driven by the computer that knew where you were. There was a crater named Landsberg that nobody ever landed there, but that was the backup landing site, and we had that one at Houston. And then there was another LMS at the Cape. We did all the checkout and the initial training and stuff, but the crews would go and train at the Cape for the last month or two before they landed, and they would always have the landing site that was a fiberglass model painted white with sand to look like the real landing site.
Yeah, a little bit different from what they do today, huh?
Yeah, a whole lot. In fact, when they first started doing these digital, even the shuttle landing, when we were doing the drop test, had a bigger, fancier model, and it was in color, but we still use the camera model system. The stars, when they had a big ball about 3 feet in diameter that was painted flat black, and there were little steel balls in it that represented the constellations, and they would shine a bright light on it. It was in a closet, shine a bright light on it, and it looked like real stars out the window. They were never able to get the thing when you're just flying along in orbit. They had some film, but it never looked right. You could only see that landing model for about the last 8,000 or 10,000 feet altitude coming in.
Yeah, okay. Let's see, there's an interesting question. Was there a noticeable difference in the way the astronauts flew the LEM depending on if they were Air Force pilots or naval aviators?
Interesting question. Anything I say can be used against me.
Yeah.
Okay, the LEM, no. The Air Force, nobody had flown a LEM before, so there wasn't any established procedure. This is the way you're supposed to do it. There was a big argument over when to shut the engine down when they had touched down. And Neil Armstrong, who was a Navy pilot, or had been, and they were all excited and scared and whatever, about to run out of fuel. They landed with 3% fuel, according to the notes that I was taking when they were landing. But he forgot or didn't shut the engine off till the pads were on the ground. So he made a very gentle touchdown. Aldrin commented about it was a very gentle touchdown because the engine was still firing. And then on Apollo 15, as soon as the blue light came on, he shut the engine off. And so it fell the last 5 feet and it hit at 7 feet per second. And his co-pilot, Irwin, commented, "There's no doubt, no denying it, we had contact." and it happened to be a little rock right under the engine that it broke the nozzle when it hit on Apollo 15. So they're kind of lucky that it wasn't still firing when it hit. Now the shuttle was different. You could tell the difference between Navy pilots, Air Force pilots, and the shuttle. The Air Force pilots would try to grease it on, and that was almost impossible to do in the shuttle. But where the Navy pilot said, if it doesn't break the airplane, it's a safe landing. I guess that answers your question.
Let's see. I think there was a question about the handling quality differences between the descent stage flight and ascent stage flight, including aborts.
Okay. The descent stage, because it was larger, more massive, less, when you fired a jet, it didn't have as much effect, and it had that engine gimbling to help it. So the descent stage was fairly easy to fly, from what I remember from 50 years ago. The ascent stage was not, because it was very light and it had those very high acceleration rates. So in anything other than that pulse mode, it was almost impossible to fly it manually. To just move the stick and point it like you would an airplane. So that's why they like that minimum impulse mode. So you could, you were doing it in little discrete steps instead of slamming it around. In the cruise, they called it very sporty. That's the word I've heard used about that. And especially when you got close to the command module, it was you don't realize what zero friction means until you try to dock two spacecraft. Because if you start moving in one direction, it's going to continue moving in that direction until you put on acceleration exactly opposite. And that's almost impossible to do manually. So it never stops. It's always moving up, down, left, right, something. And there's orbital mechanics too. That if you're some distance away from a spacecraft and start firing forward instead of flying towards it, you go towards it and then you climb because of orbital mechanics effects. If you're going faster than the command module, then you're going to climb. And we had to convince some of them that was real. But so all that put together, the descent stage I considered easy to fly. The ascent stage was antsy.
I think we have time for one more question here.
It's from 52 years ago.
Yeah. So there's a question here about what kind of feedback you got from the crews in terms of the fidelity of the simulator in relation to control response and authority. And maybe a kind of secondary part would be, how did the simulation change from flight to flight? Did it evolve based on crew responses?
Yes. Let's see. Yes to all of the above. Let's see. For example, and when Apollo 11 docked, they weren't quite lined up. Like you want to come in like that, and he was misaligned about 15 degrees when he bumped that collar that was supposed to dock them. So, and they were both in attitude hold. So both vehicles were trying to hold their attitude, and it did this for a few seconds with all the jets firing before he realized what was happening and turned the attitude hold off in the limb. So when they got back, that's one thing we had to do immediately was put in a mod to simulate misaligned vehicles. And fuel slosh was another biggie. That when Apollo 10 flew the mission before 11, they said that the fuel slosh was a lot worse than they expected. And so actually the time they landed on the moon, that's what my job was trying to get I got a fuel slosh model in so they could fly it about 2 weeks before they went to the moon. But and then while we were doing that, Grumman was putting baffles in the tanks so that our model was wrong. So we had to keep tuning the fuel slosh model to match what happened. And then Apollo 12 almost backed into a crater. They had meant to land about he thought he'd landed about 100 feet past the edge of a crater, and they found a bug in the cross pointer that for the last 30 seconds or so, he thought he was coming straight down, and he was actually backing up at 2 feet per second. And if he backed up another 10 seconds, he would have hit the wall of a crater, and who knows, it might have tipped over. But so we had to add a mod to simulate not landing on a flat surface. As far as handling qualities and all, that was MIT's department. We didn't really get into that. You know,
Okay,
they designed the DAP, you know, the digital autopilot, which was really a SAS, stability augmentation system. You know, the rate, command, attitude, hold. But that was MIT's department. We weren't research. We were training. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think it spoke to it.
Yeah, from one limb to the next, they did a major redesign of things for Apollo 14, so it could carry that, or 15, so it could carry that little dune buggy on the side. And so we would have to change the mass properties, you know, that kind of stuff. And after Apollo 12, the command module actually did put it down to the 50 mile per centium, or 50,000 feet. I mean, just things like that changed.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just looking at the questions here. I think we got most of them. There was a question about, where is the engine arm circuit breaker switch that was broken off during Apollo 11?
Okay, it was over on, yeah. I don't know if this thing will go back to those slides, but you know, I showed you that thing with all the buttons and circuit breakers. It was on Buzz Aldrin's side of the cockpit, and he bumped it, and he had to hold it in with a pencil to make sure during the ascent to make sure the engine didn't shut off during the launch back to orbit.
Okay, great. I think we covered most of the questions here, and we're over an hour now here. So thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I think everyone in the section and just overall nationally will appreciate your insights here. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to email me. I can email me at aiaa.hrs.chair@gmail.com. And if there's any comments there, or if you have any comments about how the Zoom connection was, or how we set this up, let me know. Again, thank you, Al, from the whole section. Appreciate it.
Live long and prosper.
All right. Thanks, everyone.